So, assessing sex offenders is not new, but it wasn't until the 1980s and 90s that many new tools were developed. So, um, first, I want to talk about some developments, a little history about assessment tools, the goals of assessments, and then kind of acknowledge that these are works in progress, right? The one thing about research and science, kind of like when we talked about typologies and theories, is that as new evidence becomes available, we update typologies, we update theories to accommodate these new facts and new information. So let's jump into the history and the development. So uh, two generations of assessments have been identified. So the first generation generally refers to unstructured professional judgment. So this might correspond to what we referred to as non-actuarial assessment. So this type of assessment yielded more wrong than accurate results. They're generally based on clinicians interviewing clients and based on their professional judgment and from their training and experience as a professional, right? So formal risk factors had not been identified or relied upon to develop uh, a prediction of risk at this point. So generally this type of older non-actuarial assessment is considered unreliable, maybe ineffective in the ability to distinguish between the most dangerous or highest risk of recidivism versus the least dangerous, the lowest risk of recidivism. So then we kind of jump into the second generation of assessments. And so uh, the use of these types of assessments really gained steam in the 1990s. And so they involve relying on, you know, empirical based risk factors, right? Things or variables that have been identified by research that correlate, that associate with the likelihood for recidivism, right? Things like criminal history, certain demographics. And so, right, this is not a new idea. Certainly back into the 20s and 30s, there were empirical based recidivism assessments for parolees, although they weren't widely used. Um, Subsequently, assessments like that were developed um, with newer and greater amounts of information. And so it just made sense, as the information we have grew, the amount of information and things we look for among criminals to predict recidivism also grows, right? This list of factors that matter, as that inventory grows, so does the things that we look for. So these types of second generation assessments were not viewed as psychological tools, but more geared towards helping decision makers in the criminal justice system appropriately manage uh, people, right? These offenders. And during this time, important assessments like the psychopathy checklist revised, or I should say the psychopathy checklist and then the psychopathy checklist revised were developed. And it assesses the psychological construct of psychopathy and how it relates to violence and criminality. And so other assessments at the time were also developed, and we'll talk more about psychopathy later in the lesson. So, additionally, with the second generation of assessment tools, um, we focused on community protection, right? So, we really start to feel our way towards aiming decisions based at risk of recidivism. And so, laws regarding sex offenders in the 1990s began to focus on protecting the community. And so, the assessment tools and decisions within criminal justice agencies also began to focus on protecting the community and focusing on high risk and delivering resources to that group as opposed to throwing the exact same amount of resources towards low risk offenders. So the assessment tools that were required for these kinds of decisions by criminal justice decision makers and policy analysts and officials began to identify more accurately high, moderate, and low risk offenders, especially in regard to sex offenders, right? Recall that, right? The Jacob Wetterling Act, Miranda's Law, right? These were all in the early and mid 1990s. And so these assessment tools came right as these laws were being put into place, and these other federal practices and state level practices were also being adopted. And so the main goal of using an assessment tool is to provide that risk level, right? Sometimes when we talk about community supervision, we've been talking about low, moderate, and high, but sometimes they break moderate out into low, moderate, and high, moderate um, in a more general way for offenders, not necessarily all sex offenders. But we need ways and tools that help us establish that level of risk. So decision makers require an estimate of risk, but an estimate of the potential consequences of committing a sex crime and any potential mitigating factors. And so, um, right, so these assessments can be used not only in determining what sort of a sentence an offender should have, whether to release an offender on parole from prison or not, or how best to develop a strategy for them to re-enter if they've served their complete time and their sentence is up for jail or prison, right? Whether a person should be sentenced to probation and what the conditions of their probation should be. But they can also be used uh, for bail hearings, right? Should a person be remanded, right, be held without bail until their trial, or should they be released ROR, right, released on their own recognizance? So um, that's another important decision point, made by a judge. And so judges may order a specific bail amount for the defendant to be released. They can deny bail. Um, and so lots of things that good assessments should do. And this is not a complete and exhaustive list, but, and it's not for you to write down, but it's to get you to think about what an assessment should do, right? It should determine risk factors, um, whose nature, origins, and effects can be understood, right? That's part of being objective, right? Enable reliable and valid assessments of useful causal factors. And so, when repeated, they need to yield the same information for the same person, right? If nothing has changed, and they need to be s- empirically sound and valid, right? They need to be useful in a lot of ways and be accurate. So that would be reliable and valid. They need to provide precise estimates of recidivism risk. I know low, moderate, and high doesn't sound very quote unquote precise, but it does help us figure out which group or groups of offenders receive the highest level of supervision and intervention and which ones should receive the lowest level of intervention and supervision, and then that in between group. And so precise becomes um, a term of art here. It's not precise in and of itself, right? We'd like for a tool to be able to say there's a 98% chance that this person will recidivate, and right, and the more you pigeonhole yourself, and I say this as someone who would be developing a tool, the more that a developer pigeonholes themselves to a number, the greater the chance that they'll be wrong. And so using broad categories like low, moderate, and high are effective, and we want those categorizations to be exact and accurate. We want assessment tools to examine all relevant factors that should and could be considered. We want to inform the development and treatment of specific groups of people. We want to develop certain management strategies for, say, that someone is like on community supervision. So we want the assessment tool to help us figure that out as well. We want to allow the assessment of both long-term and short-term changes in risk. So we talked about both static and dynamic factors. And so a good tool should assess or account for all of those kinds of things. We want to incorporate protective factors as well as risk factors. So we talked about mitigation. So protective factors are things that, if they're present, they reduce the risk. Whereas a risk factor, if it's present, increases the chance that something will happen. And so a protective factor would reduce the risk of recidivism, while a risk factor increases the chance of recidivism. So a good assessment tool will account for both protective and risk factors. We want to facilitate um, engaging the patient or client or the offender in the assessment process. We just don't want it to leave it to some person behind a desk or a chair reading paperwork, right? You may gain better and more information by engaging not just the offender, but other stakeholders in the process, right? The police officers, court records, victims, things like that. So we want to engage the offender to be a part of the assessment process as well. That can lead to them being engaged in the intervention and treatment process as well. So engaging early in the process signals that what they have to say matters, and it's within their realm or within the possibility of them to guide their own ship down a certain trajectory or path. And we want the things to be implemented, like, so if an assessment tells us, well, use this treatment or try this type of intervention or this category of interventions in terms of supervision level, right? We want those to be easy to implement in a wide variety of settings. And so, right, recall that when we talk about research methods, there's something called external validity, right? Right. Does this generalize? Do the findings generalize across all circumstances or in only certain narrow circumstances? And so we want assessment tools to help us have a way to implement treatments and interventions and supervision strategies in a wide variety of settings, not just for offenders who are have completed their sentence and are leaving prison, right? We want to be able to use this for maybe bail decisions, or whether to sentence someone, to help us define what sort of strategies could be used on someone's probation or parole, right? So the more comprehensive in that regard, the better the tool. So assessments that exist today, right? No assessment is perfect, and none certainly um, meet all of those goals. So we have to decide what are the goals we're looking for when we decide which type of assessment tool we're going to implement. So when it comes to risk factors, right, we know there are several. We talked about static and dynamic risk factors already, right? Prior offense history, that is something that is static, that cannot change. There are demographic factors, things that happened in the past that are also static, but there are attitudinal uh, things that can change, behaviors that can change. So, in order to, you know, from least or most correlated, or from the strongest to the weakest factor, right, we want to look at um, those things that matter. So, I guess I'll put it this way. So, if we look at things that are least correlated or least strong in predicting to the greatest strength in predicting, they would be things like personal distress or a mood disorder, whether the person has psychosis, right, which is they have breaks with reality, right, and in perceiving and reacting to reality. Uh, Violence used in the offense for which they're being consulted on, right? Whether they're being charged with or have just been sentenced for. Do they have substance abuse, uh, a prior violent offense? Do they have low intelligence? Do they have a juvenile record? Prior adult criminal record? What's their age? Negative or deviant slash criminal companions, friendship? Is that their social network? Whether they have antisocial personality disorder and or psychopathy, and then do they have deviant sexual interests? And so those are again from least to greatest in terms of predicting whether someone would recidivate. So each of these is a known risk factor to be right. You want these things to be included in your assessment tool.